Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. We are moving on to our second unit, if you're one of my students, that being the unit on political parties. What we're going to be looking at over the course of this unit is how political parties in America came to exist and what function they serve in modern American political culture. And today, what we're going to do as an introduction of sorts is look at a very brief history of how political parties came to be in the United States. By the time this video is over, you should be able to explain why political parties emerged in the U.S. and describe the rise of the modern two-party system we have today with the Democrats and the Republicans. Also be able to define or identify these historical parties in the United States: the Federalists, the Democratic Republicans, the Jacksonian Democrats, and the Whigs. So before we talk about the history of political parties, it's important to talk about what a political party actually is. Political parties seek to elect candidates to office by giving them a party identification, and that identification should make them more easily recognizable to the public. So for example, by knowing that Barack Obama and Joe Biden are Democrats, that should give the voting public a jumping off point to better understand their political beliefs or their ideology. Okay, so primarily political parties exist to the general public as a label. You should know by seeing that a candidate is a Republican what they generally believe in. Okay, for example. They also are an organization that advocates for their candidates. They raise money. They run commercials on TV and radio. They go door to door campaigning on behalf of their candidates. Political parties are also a set of leaders that in a strong party can influence policy and control most of the major branches of government. So that's what a political party is. Now we're going to talk about how political parties actually came to be and why they exist in America in their current form today. It's important to point out, first of all, that political parties were not initially intended by the Founding Fathers, and there's really no provision for them in the Constitution or anything like that. In fact, George Washington was so disgusted by the idea of political parties that he specifically warned against them in his farewell address before he left office in 1797. He said political parties are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and usurp for themselves the reins of government. In other words, political parties would enable unscrupulous people to gain power and influence they would not otherwise gain, and thereby ruining the government, more or less. Now, George Washington probably knew that America wasn't going to listen on this one, because by the time he left office in 1797, there were already political parties. So let's talk a little bit about those. The first political parties in the United States emerged primarily because of a rivalry between two of Washington's cabinet members. Alexander Hamilton, seen there on the left, was the first Secretary of the Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson, future U.S. President, was at that time the Secretary of State. They did not like each other and had strong philosophical differences over the role of government. Jefferson, for one, believed in a weak federal government that gave more power to the people. And they became known as Republicans. They were officially later on known as the Democratic Republicans, but generally just known as Republicans. The implication there was that Hamilton secretly wanted a monarchy or an extremely strong government that would take power away from the people. It's important to point out before I go on and talk about anything else, this is not the same Republican Party that exists in 2013. It's a completely different organization, just the same name. Okay, anyway, for their part, Hamilton and his like-minded people took the name Federalists, which was a term that had been used in the 1780s to identify people who supported the ratification of the Constitution, wanting a stronger central government. Now, eventually, because of a variety of reasons, the Republicans prevailed and sort of became the stronger of these two. George Washington did not belong to a political party, as you can imagine, based on his admonition against them in his farewell address. John Adams, who was Washington's vice president, was a Federalist and got elected in 1796. But he got crushed in the election of 1800 by Thomas Jefferson, who was the first in a long string of Republican presidents. And the Federalist Party basically by 1815 or so had ceased to exist, and America was essentially a one-party system at that point. But other parties emerged and created a second-party system. In the 1820s, Andrew Jackson and his followers, who opposed the policies of the National Republicans, became known as Democrats. And this is the same Democratic Party that exists today. It's the oldest continuously operating political party in the U.S. And with Andrew Jackson's election to the presidency in 1828 and again in 1832, the Democrats became the most powerful party in the country. But Andrew Jackson was not popular to everyone. He was considered to be a very strong, heavy-handed leader and took a lot of actions that angered a lot of people, that sort of went against what the populace wanted. And as a result, another party emerged to oppose him, and they were called the Whigs. And the Whigs emerged because they didn't like Andrew Jackson. That's the only thing these people had in common. There were Whigs in the North, there were Whigs in the South, there were Whigs out West. And they had virtually nothing in common except their hatred of Andrew Jackson. So the Whigs don't actually last very long because, again, they don't have a very strong platform or philosophy, and there was a lot of bickering internally between the different sides, the Northern Whigs, the Southern Whigs, and the Western Whigs. Also, the Whigs had a bad habit of electing candidates to office who died. I'm talking about the presidency, of course. There were two people from the Whig Party elected president. One was William Henry Harrison, who was elected in 1840 and then died 30 days after taking the oath of office of pneumonia. And then Zachary Taylor, who was elected president in 1848, died after about a year and a half of food poisoning. And the people who replaced Harrison and Taylor were not very strong Whigs and sort of made the Whig Party look bad. So they sort of fall apart. The defining political issue for almost everyone in the mid-1800s was the debate over slavery. Democrats and Whigs both sort of tiptoed around this issue because Democrats and Whigs were both national parties that had members all over the country. They had Northern and Southern supporters, and they didn't want to basically cut themselves in half by taking a side on slavery. For example, if the Democratic Party, if they came out against slavery, they would lose their Southern support. But if they came out in favor of slavery, they would alienate the Northerners in their party. So they didn't really take a strong stand either way for a long time. But inevitably, these parties eventually sort of come out one way or the other, and they begin to sort of fall apart, especially the Whigs, who, again, had Northern and Southern members and couldn't maintain unity over the slavery issue. So from the ashes of the Whig Party and several other minor parties, you get the modern Republican Party, which started off as a third party. They ran a few candidates starting in the midterm elections of 1854. They ran a presidential candidate named John Fremont in 1856. And then in 1860, they get Abraham Lincoln elected president in a very crowded field of four major candidates. And this makes the Republican Party a major party. The Republican Party is, to this day, the only third party ever to become a major party. After the Civil War is when you begin to see the two-party system we have today emerge. And it became pretty clear pretty quickly after the Civil War how the country was going to split. Anyone who had supported the Union and lived in the North during the Civil War was pretty much going to be a Republican. And anyone who either had supported slavery, supported the Confederacy, or had opposed the war was a Democrat. And so you had some Northern Democrats. You didn't have many Southern Republicans, but you had Northern Democrats because there were a lot of people in the North who had opposed the Civil War and didn't understand why they were fighting to preserve the Union. That changed in 1896 when the Democrats nominated for president a populist from Nebraska named William Jennings Bryan, who was strongly Protestant religious and really paid more attention to farmers and poor people that lived primarily in the South or in the West. And so those Northern Democrats end up flipping and becoming Republicans. And at that time, in the early 20th century, that turn of that century, you have a very, very strong regional divide. And to illustrate that, I put up the presidential election results by county as of 1904, where you see anywhere north of the Mason-Dixon line is almost completely red, indicating they had voted for Roosevelt, the Republican candidate. That's Teddy Roosevelt, by the way. And in the South, almost to a man, voting for Alton Parker, the Democratic candidate. And you can tell, like in states like Mississippi and South Carolina there, the Democratic Party was so strong there was virtually no Republican support. The Republican Party might as well not have even existed in those areas. And of course, there have been realigning elections since then, which have changed the regional divide of the political parties. But that's for another day. That'll do it for now. As always, ask me or your teacher if you have any questions, and be sure to pay attention to your syllabus if you're one of my students, and be keeping up with your ID terms as well. Take care. Cheers.